Hello and welcome to another Back to Jerusalem podcast. I'm Eugene Bach, your host for this time, and I'm coming to you live on delay from somewhere within the borders of Sweden this time, and I'm super excited to have the director of the UK office, Bethany, with me as well, who's coming to us live from the UK.
Predictable.
Yes, it is. It was so fun. I did a podcast a couple days ago with Rabbi Miles Weiss, who is in California, and he's now started his podcast with saying live on delay.
Has he?
Yeah, it was really cool. It was so much fun.
Oh, you need to trademark that.
Yes. It just rolls off the tongue now. It's kind of like, I can imagine somebody who starts a radio career and does like a million times of introducing themselves on the radio station, like WLBC, like that kind of, and then getting used to it and having to move to another radio station and having different call letters would be, yeah. Anyway.
Well, I told you, like when I listen to the podcast, sometimes I just naturally say the beginning bit at the same time because it's the same every time.
It's the same every time, but different location. So I say, live on delay, but where I'm coming from is often different. So I haven't gone back to any of the early ones for a very long time, but like listen to the ones that I did in the very beginning in the early years, like episode 1 through 100. I think we're now almost on 700.
Yeah, I think that you still had the intro though, I think.
Yeah, I did, but I don't know if it was that same kind of rhythm. That's what I'm saying. Like, I know it was live on delay, but I don't know if it was, like it is now. Anyway, I mean, you've been listening to us long enough to kind of know the rhythm. So if anybody would know, you would know.
That makes me sound sad. But it's true. I don't remember those early ones, but yeah, I think it's nice to keep a rhythm. There's kind of a nice familiarity about it. I like it.
I need to go back and listen to the first one. The first podcast we ever did were super fun. It wasn't called the B2J podcast. It was called
The Tom and Eugene Show.
The Tom and Eugene Show. And I think we did like 10 to 20 episodes or something like that. And nobody really knows that. So that's some trivia that nobody really knows. We actually did a prize thing one time where we ran like a competition or kind of like a small little online competition where people could answer questions and get free stuff. And so we asked people many different questions and people got them all except for one. When we asked, what was the Back to Jerusalem podcast originally called? Nobody got it. Because I think we had like 2 listeners.
I'm the only one?
I think you're the only one. Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm proud of that.
I think we started the Tom and Eugene Show, though, before you joined B2J.
Yeah, but I listened before then.
Really? Okay.
Well, because you have to remember that B2J was still based in Hope Church before I joined.
This was before Hope Church. The Tom and Eugene Show was before Hope Church.
Sorry, yeah, I'm talking about, I went back to the beginning, so in those early days. But on our website, so for anyone that wants to go back and listen to the Tom and Eugene Show, they won't find it because it's not on the website anymore. So yeah, they've got lost somewhere, so people won't be able to access those.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to them. Well, actually, I kind of do. Our website has gone through so many changes, and in the beginning, I created our website. I'm not a website creator. So in the very early days, like in the early 2000s, before, people started building websites using all these different programs, at that time, the only way you could write a website was through HTML. So I had to learn HTML through a book. I mean, you couldn't even go onto YouTube or Google. Google didn't even exist then. So
Back in my day,
I had to use AOL Online. It was a dial-up in Hong Kong. I would plug in my phone.
Light switches in my day.
I plugged my phone line into the computer, and then you'd have to wait for it to ring up and dial in. And then I bought the domain. I actually stole the domain. So I had to steal the Back to Jerusalem domain because it had already been registered through somebody who died that registered it for us. But he died without giving us any of the information on how to get it back. So the only way we could get it back was to pretend to be him and buy the company that he owned before he died, to buy that domain and then create an email that was identical to the email that they had on file, and then send an email from that email to GoDaddy.com to get the login information for BackToJerusalem.com. It was a big thing, but it was a puzzle. It was a fun way to figure out a puzzle. We've been doing that since then. But what we did was I stayed up all night and all day. So I would do these like benders where I wouldn't sleep for like 2 or 3 days. I would just eat Doritos, drink soda, and write HTML code. And I copied it directly out of the books. And you would have to copy every letter. If one little thing was off, one little symbol, not just letters, it was like symbols as well. If there was one little symbol off, it was like a little bit like writing, what was that called back in the day in the 80s and 90s, when we had to write MS-DOS. So you had to write MS-DOS code in order to do different programs. And so I kind of had some experience with that for MS-DOS because I had to use MS-DOS for a reading program that only I and a couple other people did because I was a slow reader. I was a slow learner. So I had to go to a special classroom with other kids. And the teachers didn't always know how to use those computers. I had to learn how to do MS-DOS, which actually benefited me, so I'm happy about that. And so MS-DOS kind of reminded me a little bit of doing HTML, but HTML was like MS-DOS on crack. And I would just write all this code in order to create the images for our very first website. That's where our Tom and Eugene show was stored. When we got new website creators that came on, first we had Microsoft Front Page, which was so gay. It was really, really ghetto. But I used it. I used Microsoft Front Page. And then we began to hire people. Well, not hire people. There were individuals like Chase who came on, partnered together with us, and now runs our entire website and does it like an amazing job. And so when we went from the translation of butt ugly web page to today what we have, I think everything that was saved before got just basically lost, erased by moving from one web page designer to another. I think that's what happened. So we lost those in the data sphere forever.
I thought you were going to try and make a segue to make this relevant, but
no. No, I just wanted to share about the Tom and Eugene show. The thing that we want to cover for this podcast is our new book that has just come out. It's now available. You can go to our website and find The Lame Shall Take the Prey. This is a book that we've been super excited about. We've been working on this book for over a year. When we first went and did the research of this missionary who was the very first Westerner that we know of to ever go and live in the city of Wenzhou.
He was from Scotland, of all places.
He was. Scotland seems to be this ground of missionaries from like 150, 200 years ago.
Well, it seems to be Scotland and Wales. I mean, I know that missionaries came from all over, but so many that you and I are finding these days have their roots in Scotland or Wales. So there was something going on there where there must have been something part of the church culture that was really missions focused, because we see so many of them.
And there's a lot of people that will say, well, you know, these guys came directly out of the Welsh revival, which is simply not true, because this guy that we're talking about right now, Scott, help me, I want to say Robert Scott, just because.
Stott.
Yeah, George Stott. I've just been writing a book on Robert Morrison, so his name was bouncing around in my head, and I kept thinking of Robert Scott instead of George Stott. So George Stott is mid-1800s before, it's like, 5 decades before the Welsh revival. And so the Welsh revival, yes, turned out a lot of missionaries, and a lot of hardy missionaries came out of Scotland, out of those revivals, and went and served on the mission field, including in China. But George Stott came before that.
The amazing thing too is so this book is actually written by his wife, Grace Stott. And she talks about in the beginning how she, the first chapter is about her journey to the mission field. And she talks about George going, and they were not married at the time, and there were several people on this boat that were headed to China. And she really wanted to go, and she wasn't able to. Hudson Taylor actually told her that she wasn't well enough, that she wasn't in a good enough physical condition to go. She had some kind of sickness. And she was so heartbroken. I say that to say that these people were fighting to get a place to go to China. This wasn't like they were being paid to go or dragged out of their pews, trying to persuade them, convince them that it would be a good idea to go, and you get 10 people on a boat that can hold 100. There were people that were fighting to get a place to go and serve on the mission field. So there was something going on in Wales and in Scotland specifically, that at least that we've come across, where there was a real intense missionary sending effort.
And about a year ago, you and I were specifically looking at anything that we could find that was written or about George Stott. And you came across a kind of a reference marker at Cambridge University. So we traveled together with a small camera crew to film this journey on a series that we're hoping to release the very first videos of next year, called Chasing Legacy, where we go back to these missionaries from 100, 200, 300 years ago and look at what they did, what they sacrificed, what they said, what they taught, because we really feel there's so much gold there. There's so much power there that we haven't tapped into. One of the things that you and I agree on, and it's one of the reasons why we started this new publishing company, Underground Publishing House, is that sometimes, especially now in today's literature, it seems like a lot of things are written that don't have a lot of depth, doesn't have a lot of heart. There's also a generic way that a lot of literature, Christian literature, is written today that in many ways just seems for some reason to not have that grabbing force. And without being too spiritual about it, almost like it doesn't have the power of the Holy Spirit to reach in and grab you. Not saying that it doesn't, it just doesn't feel that way. Sean Foyt, I just listened to him. He leads a movement called Let Us Worship, and he's a worship leader. He just did an interview, and I just requested to have him on this podcast. I just sent a request to him to see if there's any way at all I could get him on the podcast. He'll probably say no. His team will probably say no. But if we could get him on this podcast, it'd be really great, because just a few hours ago, he just released a small video that he posted on social media, where he basically tells people that there is a problem today with K-Love, which is one of the largest Christian music broadcasts in America. Do you have K-Love in the UK?
I don't know if we have it, but I know of it.
Yeah, and I know they have the app, and the app is available globally. We've actually done advertisements for our meeting with K-Love. I love listening to their radio channel. I often do when I'm in areas that has it. But he's talking about today's Christian music industry and K-Love specifically, because he's been, in direct relationship with those two. And one of the things he said is that these two entities are directly in line with a lot of the LGBTQ agenda, because people that are running their advertisement, their fundraising sections, as well as their budgets, are not believers, and they're very protective over this industry. And he's actually written music that he said the Christian music industry has come back, different labels, and said we can't publish that, or K-Love has said we can't broadcast that because it's too political. And so he was saying that you will not hear anything against the LGBTQ movement. You will not hear anything that would even be thought of as against the gender affirming movement. And he specifically pointed out, because of the influence of those that are not even believers in this industry. I think that might be the case for publishing as well. That might be the case for a lot of what's out there today. So a lot of these books are, in some ways, not all, but many of these books are written so generically that they lose kind of their meaning, their depth. They're broken down to the lowest common denominator, even in the way that they're written, with such generic words, that they lose the art of language. They lose the art of telling the gospel. And we find that with George Stott and his writing, going back like 150, over 150 years ago. You and I were just finding these amazing, dense paragraphs that were sprinkled with really rich literature that wasn't just powerful in what it said, but it was powerful in the way that it was said. There was this dance, this art that was contagious to read and beautiful to witness, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, he was someone that I'd not heard of before. We didn't really know very much about him. And when we were filming Chasing Legacy, we kind of knew of his story. And it's like, is there anything that he wrote that we can get our hands on? Like, what is there that we can actually, physically get our hands on? And I found something at Cambridge University. But he didn't tell me what it was. And I remembered calling you and being like, hey, I found something. It's a letter. I think all it said was George Stott letter. So I assumed it was one that he'd written. And you were like, well, let's go see it. Let's go film it. Let's see. So we had no idea what we were walking into. And we went into Cambridge University, the four of us, not dressed for the occasion, just kind of walking in there in this incredible place. And the guy was so nice that took us in there. But it was like a real... I went to uni, right? I went to university in England, but it's just a different ballgame. And we go into this this floor had this huge kind of checkered tile on it, and there's old bookcases to the ceiling, and these oil portraits of all these people that had been to Cambridge, these kind of educated, giants. And so we're kind of walking in there like, we don't belong here. And they bring out this letter, and he has white gloves on as he's bringing it out. And so we're sitting there. You could not read the writing at all.
No.
The writing's so hard to read. I wear glasses, so I can't see at the best of times. And somehow I was able to read it. So between us, we were trying to read what it said. And
I could see, but I couldn't understand. You could understand, but you couldn't see. So we made a great team.
We did. Between us, we managed to read it. It took us a while, but we did get through it. And we realized it wasn't written by George Stott, but it was written to George Stott. And what had happened is, the reason it's called The Lame Shall Take the...
I think it was written for George Stott, on behalf of George Stott.
On behalf of, I'm sorry, yes, it was about George Stott. Yeah, on behalf of, I think it was written by his dad or his mum or something, we thought, his family. So the lame shall take the prey. The reason that it's called that, for anybody wondering, is he actually had one leg. We can talk about that more. So he had one leg, and his kind of phrase was, the lame shall take the prey. And we just thought that was such an amazing line. We had to call the book that. And we realized in this letter what had happened is, when he was 18 or 17 or 18, he'd applied for Cambridge University. He lost his leg in a farming accident, right? He'd hurt his knee or something, and it had to be amputated. And so he lost his knee at 19. And so then he applied for Cambridge University, desperate to get in, and the rejection letter came back, and the rejection letter said that he'd not made it in. And so then his family wrote a letter to Cambridge University pleading for George Stott to be allowed entry, and that's what you and I were reading. And so we realized that George Stott actually had never intended on being a missionary, never intended on going to China. He didn't grow up like Hudson Taylor at 5 years old saying, when I'm grown, when I'm a man, I mean to go and share Jesus with the Chinese. This was kind of a plan B for him. And that was kind of a fascinating thing for us to see this guy who made such an enormous impact, that his life trajectory actually came out of what can be perceived as failure. His life trajectory came out of something that didn't work out, something that failed, something that he couldn't see beyond it. He seemed to be tragedy after tragedy. And actually, it landed him in a position where he perhaps changed China forever.
Without him, so today, one of the things that I find fascinating is that, and this is one of the reasons why I specifically looked at George Stott, is because I've been living in China for a while. I've actually written about the Underground House Church in several different books. I've written the history. And outside of one other person alive today, I don't think that there's been another author to write more books about or with the leaders of the Underground House Church. And Wenzhou is an anomaly. There's no other city in all of China like Wenzhou. Wenzhou has more Christians per capita than any other city in China. It's very dense with Christians. In fact, it's estimated that there's one physical church building prior to 2019, one physical church building in China for every square kilometer. 1 out of every 3 people in the area of Wenzhou are considered to be Christian. This is massive. How did that happen? Well, it goes back to this one-legged, red-headed Scot that just went in a place. By the way, Wenzhou was nobody had ever gone there before. Getting there for a person with 2 legs was difficult, let alone a man in the 1800s. Now, in the 1800s, there was not handicap accessible airplanes and boats and hotels. There were not proper roads to travel on. He's walking through swamps. And in fact, Hudson Taylor, when Hudson Taylor sees him and he comes to volunteer for China, Hudson Taylor says, why do you think that you're going to make a difference? I mean, why you? You only have 1 leg. And he said, why me? Well, because people with 2 legs aren't going. And so he's well known for making that statement. You and I go to Cambridge because, as you said, when he was a teenager, he was working on the farm. He basically falls and hurts his knee, but it's not a very serious injury at all. But in the 1800s, I mean, little things could turn into very big things quite quickly. And so he got an infection that turned into gangrene. And the only way to save his leg after this small problem ended up being a very big problem. The only way to save his leg was by amputating it. So they had to amputate his entire leg. So they amputated his leg, and now the only promise that he has in life is becoming a teacher. So he applied to go to Cambridge, but he was rejected. So his father or somebody who was a minister writes on behalf of him to Cambridge, and Cambridge still rejects him. So the only record of him in Cambridge is a rejection letter of sorts. And without that rejection letter, which is not his plan, nobody wants to be rejected. Everybody feels horrible when they're rejected, especially if you only have 1 leg in the 1800s. You don't have a lot of options. But without that rejection, if he would have been accepted to Cambridge, he would have never transformed China, and China wouldn't be what it is today. So God used this, which reminds me of one of the quotes that he says in the book that I really love, which he says this. He was preaching to the beggars, and there were many people that were not coming to Christ. He would preach and preach and preach, and the people just didn't come to Christ. And he said, these beggars never believed the truth for themselves, but they were the means for stirring up interest in others, which I found revealing. That sometimes we preach the gospel or we do what God has called us to do, and to the person that we're ministering to, it seems like failure. It seems like a waste of time. It seems like pearls that have been tossed to the swine. But little do we know that God is moving through that person, even unwillingly, and then using them without their consent to continue that message and carrying it on. And it reminded me of someone who would become a leader later on in China, Mao Zedong, who absolutely hated Christ and Christ's followers with every fiber of his being and did everything to eradicate Christianity. And instead, God uses him against his will to catapult Christianity in China in many different ways, by unifying the language, by building a road and railway system, by unifying the people groups and the economy, bringing more of China under one roof, making it easier for missionaries to travel, to minister, to share, to speak, to connect. I thought that was a very powerful phrase that we find in that book. He says this, quote, "These beggars never believed the truth for themselves, though they were the means of stirring up interest in others."
Well, and talking about failure and what we perceive as failure or success, it says here, Grace writes, as the result of our first 10 years of labor, a church of 18 or 20 was formed. How meager apparently the return for so much labor. She goes on to say, we'd often in those days to assure ourselves of his faithfulness, who was said in due season, you shall reap if you faint not. But besides this mere handful of Christians, there were many hopeful inquirers. And during our absence of 18 months, 37 were baptized. So after 10 years, they had 18 people that were saved. And in those 10 years, they had death threats every day. They were taking children off the street, trying to give them an education, trying to give them a home, trying to give them food. And people were saying that they were stealing and harvesting their organs to make medicine. You know, that's what the Western people were doing. They had people trying to kill them. They would have, Grace says that she would walk out of her home and there would be these placards and people would write the date of their death on, you know, that we're going to kill you in 3 days or whatever. And she says that eventually it became normal. They didn't even flinch at it. There's stories that people would come to the door and try and attack Grace and George would actually take off his wooden leg and chase the people away somehow to keep them away. But I mean, they had a tough time of it. And after only 10 years, there's 18 people saved. You want to talk about success or failure? That would have been a good time to give up.
That is a story that actually, I guess he almost made it a habit from what I understand. It's not written extensively about, but sometimes it's referred to that he did take off his leg and use it as a tool to fight off people that wanted to attack him. The moment he arrived in Wenzhou, he was resisted from the very beginning. He started a boys' school for homeless children, and nobody showed up on the first day, like you said, for the reasons that you said, because there were rumors that he was going to use the Chinese hearts and lungs of little children to make medicine. This opposition from day one was massive, and it was in his face. The fact that he survived at all is a miracle, but you just couldn't beat the guy down. Not only that, but when we read his writings, he seems hopeful. He seems like the forever optimist. Like everything he writes just seems like he's having the time of his life. And even though he's facing opposition, his wife really, tells the real story of the opposition. She seems like all hell's broken loose. Everything's coming to an end. He had to flee several times until things calmed down before he would go back. But when you read his writings and what he wrote, you would never get that impression. It just seemed like he was always this person that was on the attack with happiness, ready to persevere with this understandable optimism. And there were people that I think found his optimism contagious. There was a foreword in his book that was written by Hudson Taylor himself, and it was just so beautifully written that I think it would be great if we could share that with the audience. Do you have that there?
I do. Would you like me to read it?
Please. I think that it would be wonderful to kind of share at least the introduction. So this is Hudson Taylor. For those of you that understand and know who Hudson Taylor is, he's probably the most famous missionary in all of China, if not the world. So when people think of missionaries, they specifically think of Hudson Taylor. I mean, there's other people out there as well, like William Carey, that people will mention, but Hudson Taylor's always in that top three. And he was the one that tackled China. And when George Stott went to China, he went with China Inland Mission, which is the mission organization that was started by Hudson Taylor. And this is what Hudson Taylor had to say about George Stott.
So this is Hudson Taylor's preface to Grace's book. He says, "The work of God recorded in these pages is no longer an experiment. And it is well that Mrs. Stott has been able, during her furlough, to put in more permanent form some of the incidents which many of us have heard with deepest interest from her own lips in missionary meetings or on more private occasions. It has been my privilege to be acquainted with this work from its commencement. With earnest prayer, I commended Mr. Stott to God for his difficult journey, for in those times, Wenzhou was not a free port, and the 8 days overland travel through unknown and mountainous country. So he did 8 days with one leg through mountains." I mean, it's crazy. Would have been somewhat formidable for a good walker, while for one on crutches, it was more so. He left Scotland, however, believing that the lame should take the prey, and he was spared to do so to no small extent. I had visited Mr. Stott during his early labours there and seen how much he needed domestic help and just how handicapped he was in charge of the boys' boarding school. Before I had the pleasure of welcoming Miss Siggy, who I'd known in Glasgow, on her arrival in China to become his wife. Having closely followed the progress of the work through these 25 years, and having paid my last visits to Wenzhou since Mrs. Stott left, it was with special interest and pleasure that I snatched time to read most of her manuscript. It is emphatically a story of work earnest, persevering work, which God has blessed, an unvarnished account. It brings out clearly the lights and shades of missionary service. I did not find one dull paragraph. Those who begin to read the book will want to finish it, and it cannot fail to be a blessing to the reader. It is an unfinished record, and since Mrs. Stott asked me to write a few lines of preface, a joyful letter from Miss Christabel Williams tells of the conversion of 16 of the 26 girls in the boarding school. 4 of the children were previously converted, and several of the remaining 6, the little ones of the school, were seeking the Lord. May many readers be led to pray for the work and workers in Wenzhou. J. Hudson Taylor, 1897.
Oh, yeah, I love this. So this was written posthumously? Is that how you say it? Humorously?
I don't know what you're trying to say.
Posthumously. It's like homously, or it's like after a person dies. Let's put it that way. It sounds like I'm saying after the laughter, but it
does. I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right.
Posthumously. Yeah, so it was written after his death. And it was just, there was so many letters that were written for him from his friends that we added into this book that I think are just powerful in and of themselves. There were old verses to songs that were written that I really loved as well. There were letters that came from Chinese that I really loved as well. One of them was called Good Night. I'll just read really quickly. That says, "We buried him yesterday in Cannes Cemetery. The Reverend P.W. Minto conducted the service. A number of Christian friends were present. All who knew him loved him as a true man of God and a faithful servant of Christ. Among those present was Mr. W.T. Berger, his lifelong friend whose house 24 years ago he had started for the scene of life's labor in distant China. In a few but beautifully appropriate words, Mr. Berger broke the zeal and love which animated him in his work for Christ, and he addressed words of loving sympathy and consolation to the widow, and reminded us all, for each of us the day was hastened to its close, and then we should work ere the night cometh." And then he writes, "Then we laid him to rest, singing over his grave the Christian goodnight song." I've never heard this song before, but I absolutely loved it. "Sleep on, beloved, sleep and take thy rest. Lay down thy head upon thy Savior's breast. We love thee well, but Jesus loves thee best. Good night, good night, good night. Until the Easler glory lights the skies, until the dead in Christ arise, and he shall come, but not in lowly guise. Good night, good night, good night." There we left the body sleeping in joyful hope of the resurrection till the day dawn and the shadows flee away. I remain, Dr. Mr. Broomhall, with Christian love. We have a few of those where people wrote these, I think, really amazing songs and poems that you and I were just kind of breathtaken by.
Yeah, and last time for our first book, A Voice in the Darkness, which, you and I felt that there was this gap in, I don't like to call it a market, but in the Christian pool of books for this kind of thing. And A Voice in the Darkness has sold, I think, better than we thought for these early days. So yeah, people really have connected to it. And in that one, we actually did a podcast episode, which is what we called story time, where we read one of the chapters. And we're going to do the same with this book too. And one of the most powerful chapters, I think, in this book was the chapter that we ended on, which was when George Stott passed away. And he had a friend that was with him during the hours that, or I guess the day that George Stott actually died. And it's one of the most powerful examples of writing that I've ever come across. And I remember you and I read that chapter a couple of times. It's like nothing you've ever read. It's like nothing you've ever come across. You want to talk about the way that a believer approaches his final hours. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. There were some amazing parts in this book.
One of the things that I continue to come back to is that there is a gap in really well-written literature writing. And I think that one of the reasons why is that our inspiration has been diluted by the world. And when inspiration hits you, with the power of the Holy Spirit, there is just an outcome of art and expression that I think shakes our bones, for lack of a better phrase. And we have a friend on our team. He's the director of the Back to Jerusalem Polish office. He sent me a meme. He sent us a meme. We have this like group chat, and he sent a meme on there that I love, and I want to read it to the audience because I think that this is the heart of why we want to bring out these books like this one that was written by Grace Stott about George Stott. It says this: I read old books. Why? Because I would rather learn from those who built civilization than those who tore it down. The legacy of Christianity that you and I are witnessing today was not built by us. We are the recipients of it. In many ways, we are lazily enjoying it and not adding to it. We're living under the roof of its shelter, but not doing anything to build it bigger or more grand. And some may even argue not even maintaining it. These guys built it from the foundations. They gave it the arch roofs. They gave it the beautifully designed windows, the stained glass windows that have expression and stories and character. This was the laborers who came that had a real trade. This was the art of their life, to build, to write, to not just get a book out there by using artificial intelligence or publish it using just some really quick scheme on Kindle. These guys really put a lot of thought and effort and sacrifice into it. So when you go back to these writings of a couple hundred years, it may sound old, it may sound boring, but I'm telling you, that is deception. Because when you open up the pages, whether it's through an e-version or you actually buy the printed version, there is art that jumps off of the page and it will grab you. It will jolt you, I think, as it did me. Because somebody that is not, the way these guys write, I'm just not used to reading words that are compiled in that way, that are strung together in that way. So when I read it for the first time, boom, it like punches you in the face because it somehow has a power of exactness. Does that make sense? Where they're using words that we don't use anymore in the English language. They are expressing themselves with conjunctions that have long been forgotten, an art form that has long been lost among many of us, even though we have more dictionaries at our disposal. We have Google at our fingertips. We have all of these writings that we can access in a moment's notice. But in some ways, we're bombarded with all this new stuff. And it's so noisy. It's so depth and availability. Like when I walk into an old Barnes & Noble or I go onto the Amazon website, I am hit immediately by all these new releases. And the new releases are enticing. Why? Because they have great design for their for their covers. They have amazing titles. They have very gimmicky taglines, and they get you excited. But when you read them, if you're like me at all, you're laying in bed late at night reading a book that you're excited about, and then you just are bored to death. Like you just want to jump out of a window just to make that book go away, hoping that suicide will somehow stop the pain of boredom that you get from reading such things that you have to. There are books that I've read in modern day Christian literature that bored the snot out of me so much that I will have read 2 or 3 or 4 pages and will have been daydreaming about something else. Like I'll be daydreaming about buying underwear or going and watching a movie. I'll be daydreaming about whatever, and still have to go back and think, okay, what did I just read? My brain is reading it, but in some ways, and I can speed read modern books, meaning that I can kind of skim through and understand exactly what they're saying and not miss a thing. Whereas this book, skimming, forget about it, because it's so dense. There's so much richness in the presentation of information and the language. And there's times where you read something and you're like, oh, that was good. Read that again. Oh, it's like a juicy steak where it's just savory in your mouth. When you read it with your eyes, you're able to taste it and smell it and feel it. Did you? I know that you may not have experienced it in the same way, but I kind of feel hungry for this book. I think this kind of book is just what the doctor ordered for our generation.
Yeah, of course I feel the same. That's why we're doing this. But one thing we did in the last book, in A Voice in the Darkness, and in this one, is we actually have, and this was not something we ever intended on doing, but there are so many of those lines and statements and quotes that you just go, wow, that was so good. Like I would, read it and send it to you, like, listen to what he just said. Isn't this crazy? Isn't that amazing? That we actually started kind of highlighting. We had these quote boxes throughout, because there are just some of these lines that they have that punch you in the face effect, that if you have read the book and you want to skim back through to be inspired, you want to skim back through to kind of find a place or find a chapter that really moved you, that's why we highlighted some of these quotes, because they're so powerful.
It's one of the things that I'm super excited about, is finding this old, wonderfully written literature. Unless you and I are completely moved, we are not publishing it. So we're not just going back and saying, oh, this is old, so therefore it's good. No, we're pulling out stuff that grabs us, and
we have been through a lot. Like yes. We have dug through, at this point, easily over 100 writings that yes. we have read through, that we've gone through. No, this doesn't work. Yeah, this is good, but it's not. So these are not just random books that we're finding that are old that we think, let's do it. These are ones that we've really searched for and dug through.
That you've never heard of before, you've never read before. These are being dragged out of the annals of history, dusted off, and in many ways we are also redoing them. And we had to do a lot of redoing on this book. And the reason why is because the author, Grace Stott, his wife, she did a great job by making sure that the memory of George Stott was not lost, because he didn't write anything. So we owe this book to her, but in many ways, some of her writing was not as inspirational. So we wanted to bring the best of the best to our audience without them getting lost in things that might not have really stood out.
Yeah, and so I'm aware that time's getting on, but just so people know, this is our second one that we're publishing. It's out. It came out on the 28th of August, and if you go to our website, you'll find it there. And actually, in our first book, I've had people emailing in, kind of giving comments on A Voice in the Darkness and chapters that they liked and things. And so we love that. So if you do pick it up, please let us know. Please let us know what moved you. And also we had someone write in and say, hey, have you ever heard of this guy? He wrote some great stories, and we actually made a note of him, and we're going to look into his stuff. So also things like that we love to hear, because we're a pretty small team kind of digging for this gold together.
And we are traveling all around the world. We are going to archives, places where old letters have been written, old books have been stored up, and we're digging this out. We're filming the adventure, and we're publishing the works. So we're doing both of those. Let me end this segment with the words that his wife wrote about their last moments together, which I thought was really good. And then we're going to do a separate podcast where we're going to do a story time together, where Bethany will read, just like we did the last book, a chapter of this book, so that you don't have to buy the book without hearing it first. We want you to see how this book is written so you can experience it already yourself before you even go on to Amazon or our website at backtodjerusalem.com or our publishing website at undergroundpublishinghouse.com. So here we have the very last moments of George Stott. It was 6 a.m. Nature outside was awakening in the fresh joy of morning light. The sun had risen in a sky of cloudless blue. The birds were singing their morning song just outside the slightly open window, while the carillon of the Easter bells came sounding joyously through the air. Within, we were standing on the borderland, closed by the gates which were opening to one another who have fought the good fight through Christ and was more than a conqueror. The change had come, the contracted features and glazed eyes that told of the last struggle was entered. A hurried, "He is going," escaped us. I did not expect to hear him speak again, and as conscience seemed to be fading, I said, "The Master come, and calleth for thee." He took it in, and to my surprise with a last effort said, "Then lift me up, that I may give another note of praise." Putting my arms around him, I drew him gently forward. Then as fast as his poor breath came, he turned it into praise. "Praise the Lord! Blessed his holy name!" And he repeated again and again. It was wonderful to listen to, and I could not help saying to the dear companion of his life labors, who, on her knees with only half-suppressed cries from the pangs which were rending her own heart, was holding his hands and watching the shadows of death as they passed over his face. This is a precious legacy he is leaving you. They were like words of triumph coming out from the very realms of death. "Do you know me, precious one?" she asked. "Know you, Gracie? It would be strange if I didn't know you," was the reply from George. Then, with a strength that surprised me, he added, "We have rallied together around the dish of fruit." One of their last conversations they had about the fruit of the tree of life. Many a time, and the king in his beauty was here. "Farewell, Gracie. Don't speak to me again. I am going to see the king." Those were the hallowed moments. The districtess of another of the sisters had joined us. Most tenderly and faithfully they had done what they could do for him. And then he went to be with the Lord. That's the last moments of George Stott's life, which I thought was really powerful to kind of witness from a third party's eyes, to see his interaction together with Grace. And I just love that legacy of a believer in his last moments.
Yeah.
So we will come back with another Back to Jerusalem podcast. If you are able to go to our website, see where this podcast is or wherever you got this podcast, and just listen to the next episode when it becomes available. That will be story time, where we're going to read one of the chapters from this phenomenal book, The Lame Shall Take the Prey. Thank you so much for joining us for another Back to Jerusalem podcast. Thank you so much, Bethany, for joining us for this podcast. It's always an awesome pleasure to have you with us.
Yeah, I love when we have new books to share, so my pleasure.
Me too. And thank you for downloading this podcast. Again, I'm Eugene Bach, your host for this time, coming to you live on delay from somewhere within the borders of Sweden. God bless.